Foundation series. Today we are starting Chapter 1, Introduction to Economic Thinking and Data, with a specific focus on Indian application. The big promise of this chapter is simple. By the time we are done, you will have a complete new lens for looking at the decision, trade-offs, and the data that drive real policy in India. Let's dive into it. What is economics? So, what is economic really? At its heart, it's a humanity attempt to make the sense of something very human, how we decide things, allocate resources, and interact with one another. Adam Smith, mostly we call the father of modern economics, made a fascinating observation back in 1776 in The Wealth of Nation. He noticed that when the individuals simply pursue their own self-interest, something remarkable can happen. Though what we call this invisible hand, the self-interest can end up benefiting society as a whole. It sounds almost paradoxical, but it's one of the most powerful ideas in the history of economic thought. Now, the economics naturally breaks into two big branches. Microeconomics look at individual player, households, firms, worker, and how they behave in a specific markets. Macroeconomic zoom out, look at whole economy, national output, price, unemployment, growth. And throughout these courses, we are going to use India as our primary case study. And for good reason, with over 1.4 billion pupils, a GDP of growth 3.7 trillion US dollar in 2024, and status of the world's fifth largest economy by nominal GDP and third by purchasing power parity, India is one of the fastest, richest laboratory for economic analysis on the planet. Let's move to the case study. All of you know the demonetization natural experiment. Let's start with something many of you probably remember, the demonetization November 8, 2016. That evening, Prime Minister Modi announced that rupees 500 and 600 notes would immediately stop being legal tender. Within an hour, roughly 86% of all the currency in circulation was no longer valid. It was extraordinary. What made this so interesting for economists? It was a natural experiment actually, an unplanned real-world event that let researchers study cause and effect almost like a control lab study. In the aftermath, economists observed sharp contraction in cash-dependent sectors, small traders, daily wages worker, rural markets. At the same time, digital payment adoption accelerated fast, and RBI's balance sheet showed some unusual patterns. And academic workers that followed, including researchers, used sophisticated techniques like difference in difference analysis to actually isolate the real economic effects of that single decision. What is the lesson here? Here is a good one to carry throughout this course. Economists aren't just a theorist. They are a detective using data and rigorous method to figure out what actually happened and why. Definition of economics. Okay, let's ground ourselves with a proper definition. The most influential one comes from the British economist Robin. In 1932, he wrote, "Economy is the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between end and scarce means, which have alternate uses." If you read carefully, you find out three words: do all the work, end, means, and alternate uses. Ends are our wants and goals, and honestly, human wants are practically unlimited. Scarce means are the resources which to work with time, money, land, skill and capital, all of which are finite in nature. An alternative use means the same resource can serve multiple purposes, which is exactly what forces us to choose. Opportunity cost, rational choice, equilibrium, marginal analysis flow logically from this one side. Other economists offer their own texts, like Adam Smith focused on the wealth of nation, while Alfred Marshall saw it as the study of mankind in the ordinary business of life. Or on the other side, Paul Samuelson described it as how the society uses scarce resources to produce and distribute value things. Each definition lights up a different corner of the subject. Taken together, they give us a genuinely rich picture of what economy is about. Scarcity and opportunity cost. Scarcity is where all the economic thinkings begin. It's a tension between unlimited human wants and limited resources. And here's the basic point. Scarcity isn't just a problem for poor countries or people with tight budget. It is universal. Even Mukesh Ambani sir can't buy more than 24 hours in a day. Government of India with a budget of around 45 lakh crore rupees in 2024-25 still can't fund every worthy project that competes for attention. These bring us to perhaps the single most important concept in all the economics is opportunity cost. Every choice means giving something else end up. Opportunity cost is the value of the best alternative you didn't choose. And it is not just about the money you spent. It is about the full value of everything else you could have done with the same resources. I tried to illustrate with the example. Imagine a young engineer from the Pune who is being offered a software job paying 8 lakh rupees a year. She is also considering a 2-year MBA that cost rupees 12 lakhs in fees. Most people say, or the common people say, MBA cost is 12 lakh rupees. But an economist would say, wait, real cost is 12 lakhs in fees plus the 16 lakhs in salary. She gave up over 2 years. That rupees 8 lakhs times 2. So the true economic cost of MBA is actually 28 lakh rupees. That's opportunity cost. It forces you to account for what you give up even when there is no price tag attached. Now move to the most important concept in the economics, equilibrium. So equilibrium thinking. Now let's talk about one of the most powerful tools in economics, and that is equilibrium. It is a simple state of rest. It is a situation where all the agent, buyers, seller, workers, firm have made their best possible decision, giving what everyone else is doing, and there is no natural pressure for the things to change on their own. In market, the most familiar version is where the supply meets demand. The point where the quantity seller wants to sell exactly matches what the buyer wants to buy at a given price. But here's what really powerful about equilibrium thinking. It's not a claim that make market always work perfectly. They often don't. The real power is in the discipline it imposes on our analysis. When we ask what the equilibrium here, we are forced to specify who the players are, what they want, what they are constrained, and how the system finds the resting points. And when the disruption happens like shock, policy change, new technology, equilibrium analysis give us testable prediction about how things will adjust. India give us a vivid example. Think about the Bangalore IIT corridor real estate market, where the business demand from the tech workforce has consistently outpaced supply, a classical demand driving equilibrium being pushed up. Or look at the agriculture commodity market, where the price often crash right after the harvest because the cold storage and the future market that would normally Smooth price over the time simply aren't there. Equilibrium isn't just an abstract concept. It is a practical lens for the reading world. Now, move to the micro and macroeconomics, the scope of economics, we can say. Modern economy is split into two broader branches, microeconomics and macroeconomics. They are deeply connected, but they operate at very different levels. Macroeconomics focus on individual economic units, household, firm, industry. Its core question are things like how to do consumer allocate their budgets, how do firm decide what to produce, at what price, what determine wages, is a market competitive, oligopolistic, or a monopoly market. The toolkit here include utility theory, production function, cost curve, game theory. At its heart, macroeconomic is about constraint optimization, finding the best outcome given real limitations. Macroeconomics takes the entire economy as a subject. What drives long-run growth? Why do economists cycle through booms and boosts? What causes inflation? What explains persistent unemployment? The tools are different here. ISLM, investment saving, demand and supply of money model, aggregate supply and demand frameworks, growth model, sophisticated dynamic Scottish general equilibrium model, or DSGE model that central bank and research institutions use today. And the key insight, these two levels aren't in competition. They are complementary. Like inflation, a macroeconomic phenomenon, has its roots in the micro behavior of the individual firm, setting price and worker, negotiating wages, and macro condition, aggregate demand, interest rate, shape the environment in which every individual agent operates. Go in detail with the help of table, certain dimensions. Let's look at the table which compare the micro and macro side by side across several dimensions. The first dimension is unit of analysis, micro focus on individual agent, consumer, firm, industry, macro focus on aggregate economy, variables, macro tracks price, quantity, wages, profit, cost, macro track GDP, inflation, unemployment, interest rate. Second parameter is core question. Macro asks how agent optimize and how market clear. Macro asks what drivers growth and what cause business cycles. Next parameter or dimension is tool. Macro use utility function, cost curve, game theory. Macro use ISLM curve, ASAD curve, model, growth model, DSGE model. In an example, macro give us onion price volatility and telecom price war. Macro gave us GDP growth rate, wholesale price index, inflation trends, and current account deficits. Another dimension is policy lens. Macro inform competition policy, labor law, market regulation. Macro inform monetary policy, fiscal policy, and trade policy, and keeps this table in mind as a reference map throughout the course. Every topic we touch can be located somewhere on it. Okay. Now, move to the example. The market for onions in India. Onion. The few commodities in India have illustrated basic macroeconomic principles as a vivid and dramatically as a things one. In 2019-20, onion price jumped from roughly 20 rupees per kilogram to over 100 rupees per kilogram in just a few weeks. A five-fold increase. Then the month later they crashed back below 15 rupees. What happened? Let's break it down. First, a supply shock. Delayed monsoon rain followed by excessive rainfall in Maharashtra, a major onion producing state, hampered the Kharif harvest, and supply curve shifted sharply leftward. Second, inelastic demand. Consumer demand for onion is highly price inelastic. It is a dietary staple with very few substitutions. That means even a relatively small drop in supply causes disproportionately large price spikes because demand barely budgets. Thirdly, structural failure. Limited cold storage infrastructure and concentrated wholesale market, the APMCs, mean that the traders couldn't smooth price by releasing store surplus during shortfalls. So what economists call intertemporal arbitrage supply wasn't available. In this, the fourth part, policy response, the government imposed export bans and stock limits. And these interventions moved supply curve but also created their own distortion, discouraging investment in storage and affecting price in later seasons. So, this episode is a perfect demonstration of how the basic supply and demand analyze generate real actionable insight into what happens in actual market. Now, let's move to the historical evaluation of economic thoughts. Economy as a formal discipline has a rich intellectual history. Let's trace it through four major phases. The phase one we call classical economics, roughly 1776 to 1870. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nation status of with the invisible hands and decision of labor. David Ricardo develops the theory of comparative advantage, showing that the trade benefits all nations even when one is more productive at everything. Thomas Malthus introduced diminishing return. Phase 2, the marginal revolution and new classical economics from 1870 to 1930. Three economists, Given in England, managers in Australia and Welders in Switzerland, independently developed the concept of marginal utility. These resolve the same famous diamond water paradox. Why are the diamonds so expensive while the water is essential for life is cheap? Because what matters is marginal utility. Water is abundant, diamonds are scarce. Alfred Marshall synthesized these ideas into supply and demand framework that remain economics core workhorse today. Phase 3, the Keynesian revolution from 1936 onward. The Great Depression exposed a fatal fall in the classical theory. Markets do not automatically restore full employment. John Keynes argued in this 1936 general theory that aggregate demand, total spending in the economy determine the output and employment, and that active government intervention is sometimes necessary to stabilize the things. Fourth phase is monetarism and new classical economists from 1970s associated with the Friedman, Lucas and Sargent. These schools emphasize money supply, rational expectations and limits on the government effectiveness. Each school built on and on pushback against the one before it. Knowing these intellectual lineage help you to navigate economics debates today. Let's move to the economic indicator, gross domestic product, into a deeper way. The vital sign of an economy, GDP is, and the big one is GDP, you can say the biggest one is the GDP. Gross domestic product or the GDP is the total monetary value of all the final goods and services produced within a country's border during a given period, typically a quarter or a year. India uses a system of national accounts 2008 methodology with the 2011 and 12 as a base year. There are three equivalent ways of or to measure the GDP, but the most commonly used is expenditure approach, where the GDP is equals to C, consumption, I, investment, G, government consumption, export minus import. Private consumption, what the household spend is, and investment, fixed capital formation plus inventory changes, and government consumption, export minus import, refers net export. For India in 2022-23-24, private consumption make up roughly 58% of GDP, while the investment around 31%, or government consumption around 11%, and the net export are actually negative. India imports are more than its export. In absolute term, nominal GDP in 23-24 was approximately 293 lakhs crore rupees, or about USD 3.5 trillion. Real GDP at constant rate of 11-12 price was 172 lakhs crore rupees. That gap between the two numbers is inflation. Real GDP growth for 22-23 was estimated at 7.3%, strong by any global measure. One important distinction worth knowing: GDP at market price equals gross value added at basic price plus product taxes minus product subsidies. For sectoral analysis, or analysts often prefer GVA. It spread out tax distortions, actually, gross value added. Now, inflation. Measuring the general price level. Inflation is general price level. The second major indicator is inflation, the rate at which the price rise over time, eroding the purchasing power of money. To measure it, we build a price index that track the cost of representative basket of goods and services. The formula is inflation rate is equal to CPI2 minus CPI1 bracket close divided by CPI1 into 100. India used two main indexes, each serving a different purpose. Consumer Price Index, or CPI, measure changes in retail price paid by annual consumer. It compiles monthly by ministry and form the basis for the RBI's inflation targeting framework. Introduced in 2016, the base year is 2012. Crucially, food and beverage account for about 45.9% of the CPI basket, which is why the food price shock hit the headline inflation figure so hard. The RBI's mandate is to keep CPI inflation at 4%, within a band of plus minus 2 percentage point. When the inflation reached 6% in 22, driven by the global commodity price increase after the Ukraine war, the RBI raised the repo rate from 4% to 6.5% across the 6 step, a total tightening of 250 basis points. The whole price index, or the WP, compiled by the Officer of Economic Advisors under the DPIIT, measure price at the wholesale level. It is a basket given the highest weight to manufacturer's product at 64.2%. WPI tends to be a better leading indicator of industrial input cost pressure, closely watched by producers and procurement officers. Now, unemployment measuring. The unutilized labor force, you can say. The basic formula for unemployment is simple. Divide the number of unemployed by the labor force and multiply by 100. And by measuring unemployment in India is considerably more complicated because India's labor market is shaped by informalities, seasonalities, and disguised unemployment and widespread underemployment. The primary source is the periodic labor force survey. The PLFS conducted by ministry since 2017 and 18. PLFS uses 3 different approaches to measure the employment status, and the choice of approach matters a lot for the number you get. The usual principle and the subsidiary status UPSS capture a person's primary activity over the past year. These give the lowest unemployment rate because even subsistence self unemployment counts as a employment. The current weekly status, that is CWS, capture activity in the reference week, and these give a higher unemployment rate. The current daily status, CDS, records employment status for each day of the reference week. This is the most comprehensive measure and best at capturing disguised unemployment and underemployment. Now look at the actual PLFS 22-23 numbers. Overall unemployment under UPSS was 3.2%, but urban males had a rate of 5.5% and urban female 8.0%, significantly higher. The labor force participation rate was 57.9% overall, but only 37% for women. Critical point here, a 3.2% headline unemployment rate does not mean India has full employment. Under the UPSS, someone is classified as employed if they work even a single hour in the reference period. Subsistence farming and casual self-employment count. The reality is far more nuanced than the headlines suggested. Now, next is IPP and fiscal indicators. What is IPP? So, two more indicators, Index of Industrial Production, IPP, and the fiscal metrics matter to us. IPP measures short-term changes in the volume of industrial production. With a base year of 11-12, it covers three sectors: manufacturing, which dominate at a 77.6%, weight covering 809 items, mining at 14.4%, and electricity at 7.9%. Why does IIP matters? It tends to move ahead of GDP, reflecting investment and consumption demand, and it is sensitive to both monetary and fiscal policy. A sharp IIP contraction is an earlier warning of broader economic stress. We saw this clearly during demonetization in late 2016 and dramatically during the COVID-19 lockdown in April-May 2020. Fiscal indicators. The government's balance between revenue and expenditure is one of the most closely watched data set in Indian economy policy. The fiscal deficit is the excess of total government expenditure over total receipt excluding borrowings. India's FRBM Act of 2003 set a target of bringing these deficit to 3% of GDP, a target that was dramatically breached in 2022-21 when it hits 9.2% of the GDP, reflecting the enormous cost of COVID-19 relief. The revenue deficit is the portion of borrowing used to fund consumer consumption rather than investment. High revenue deficit is considered practically damaging for the long-term growth. It means the government is borrowing not to build roads or hospital, but simply to pay the salary and subsidies. Table 3 shows you major economic indicators in India within a selected year. This table brings together major indicators for India across three key areas: years 1920, 2021, 22-23. The pattern tells a clear story. 1920, the economy was already showing GDP growth rate of just 3.9%, a decade low at that point. 2021, COVID-19 and national lockdown, every indicator deteriorated sharply. GDP contract by 6.6%. India's first full year contraction indicates. Unemployment spiked to 8.5%. Industrial production fall by 8.4%. Fiscal deficit ballooned to 9.2% of GDP. And notably, the CPI inflation stayed elevated at 6.2%. Even during the contraction, a reminder that supply disruption can drive inflation even in a recession. By 22-23, recovery was clearly underway. GDP growth returned to 7%. Unemployment fell to 4%. IIP recovered to 5.4% growth, but the fiscal deficit remained elevated at 6.4% of GDP, reflecting the lasting fiscal cost of the pandemic. Here the lesson for the viewers: this table, no single indicator tells the complete story. You need to read GDP growth rate alongside the inflation, alongside the employment rate, alongside the fiscal position. Economy is a system, and its a vital sign need to be read together. Always ask, what does the data look like when they're disaggregated? And always check, is this a provisional or a final? So, Indian data. Next thing is, for us, the infrastructure of economic knowledge. India has one of the most extensive statistical system among the developing countries, with the roots going back to the colonial era and major expansion since independence. By knowing the data existence isn't enough. You need to know where to find it and what it covers and how it was built. Here are 6 major sources you will use throughout these courses. First, RBI's database on the Indian economy, or DBIE, at the rate you understand. This is your primary source for monetary data, banking statistics, interest rate, foreign exchange reserve, and the balance of payment. Free comprehensive over 200 or 2,500 variables for monetary policy or external sector analysis started here. Second, MOSPI and the National Statistical Office at mosp.gov.in, the apex body for financial official statistics. GDP estimate, CPI, IIP, PLFS, all come from here. Third is NSSO round, large-scale national representative household serve the conduct since 1950. These are the foundation for the poverty measurement and consumption analysis in India. Fourth one is CMIEs, consumer parameters, household survey, a private panel survey of approximately 170,000 household, conducted 4 times a year, available by subscription and invaluable for high frequency analysis of employment, income and consumption, especially during the fast moving events like demonetization and COVID-19. Fifth one is the Union Budget at indianbudget.gov.in with comprehensive data on revenue, expenditure, deficits and debt. Sixth one is PLFS, the Periodic Labor Force Survey, for timely and granular data on India's labor market, available here. Then There is one case study which help you to understand this more. CME, consumer pyramids and demonetization shock. This case study brings two threads together: the 2016 demonetization shock and the value of high frequency private data. On November 8, 2016, you will recall 86% of India's currency in circulation become legally invalid overnight. Here's the puzzle. Official GDP data for the quarter 3 of 16-17, the quarter most directly hit, showed real GDP growth of the 7%, barely different from the pre-demonetization trend. Many economists were immediately skeptical, and CMIE's consumer pyramids data told a very different story. Household income together deaccelerate sharply in November and December 2016, particularly for self-employed workers and daily wage earners who were cash dependent. The CMIE unemployment rate rose from roughly 6.2% in October 16 to 9% by January 17 before recovery. Consumption of durable and non-fuel items flew sharply in the weeks after the announcement. So why didn't official GDP capture this? Because India's GDP methodology rely heavily on the formal sector data, corporate filling. An annual survey of industry, the IIP, the formal economy, where the most of the demonetization disruption actually occurred, is estimated indirectly using organized sector proxy rather than direct measurement that create a blind spot. The lesson here is no single data source give a complete picture. Official GDP estimate, CMI household survey and high frequency indicator like GST collection and UPI transaction are all need to be read together. Triangulate to understand what actually happening. Now, move the data set. Structure, cross-section, time series, panel. Getting access to data is just a first step. Before applying any statistical techniques, you need to understand and what kind of data you are working with. Three fundamental structure, cross-sectional data. Think of it as a photograph. It captures many individuals, households, firms, or state, all at once at single moment in time. The NSSO Consumers Expenditure Survey work this way. A snapshot of the spending pattern across the thousands of households at one point in a time. Great for understanding the difference across the unit right now. Time series data. This is the opposite. Instead of breadth, it offers depth. You track a single unit that is involved over the time. IIP is a classical example. Released monthly, it shows how factory output rises and falls across the economy over time. Panel data, the best of both worlds, multiple units, track over multiple times, period, follow the same households or states across several years, and you can watch their stories unfold. CMI consumer pyramid does this, as does the PLF when it revisits the same household across the quarter. What does this matter? It determines what question you can credibly answer. Long-run trends need time series. Cross-state comparison needs cross-sectional data. But if you want to know whether a specific policy cause as a specific outcome, only panel data gives you the causal traction to find out, because it's let you compare each unit against itself over the time, controlling for the persistent unobservable characteristics. Panel data is the is a gold standard for causal interference. Keep that in mind. Gold standard. Now move to the variable, frequency and metadata. 3 practical skills you need to handle any economic data set properly. Understanding the variable types, data frequency and metadata. Okay? On variable types, one of the most common trap is assuming that the same word means the same thing across the different data set, but it doesn't. Employment means different things in the PLFS and in CMIE data because the definition and the reference period differ. A person would be classified as employed in one and unemployed in another, not because their situations changed, but because the measurement rules diverge. Beyond the definition, distinguish between stock and flow variable. Stocks are photographed, a value at a single moment, money supply, foreign exchange reserve, total outstanding debt are all stock. Flows are videos. They record movement over a period. GDP, annual investment, monthly exports are all flows. Mixing them up, producing analytical nonsense. Then there is the nominal versus real distinction. Nominal variable used to day's price. Real variable strip away the price change and express everything in the price of chosen base year. India's GDP in 2023-24 was nominally rupees 293 lakh crore, but only 172 lakh crores in real term. That gap is inflation. Comparing nominal value across years conflict genuine growth with mere price increase. On the frequency, data arrive at different speeds. Minutes by minute for financial market, annually for the national accounts. Match your data frequency to your questions. Annual for growth or long-term trends, quarterly for the business cycle, monthly for near-term conditions. Now what is metadata? The data about data, source, agency, survey, methodology, unit of measurement, base years, sample size, knowing limitations. Reading metadata isn't optional. It is non-negotiable part of serious analysis. Now, with the help of case study, try to explore more. The RBI MPC from inflation data to interest rate decision. Let's bring everything together with a case study, tracing exactly how economic data flow through the institutions and become actual policy. RBI Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC, was established under the Amendment RBI Act in 2016. It meets roughly every 2 months with a clear mandate. Keep CPI inflation at 4% within a tolerance band of 2 to 6%. Here the step 1, data collection. Every month, Ministry collect price data from approximately 1,114 urban market and 1,181 villages across India, covering over 300 items in the Consumer Price Index basket. The data is typically released 12 to 14 days after the end of each month. Step 2. MPC analyze before each meeting. RBI economists analyze the full picture, headline, CPI and its component, food, fuel, core, inflation. Wholesale price index act as a leading indicator of supply chain pressure, real GDP growth and output gaps, exchange rate movement and global commodity price, household inflation, expectation and credit growth indicators. Step 3. The decision. The 6-month MPC votes on the policy repo rate. In 2022-23 tightening cycle, as headline, CPI breached 7%, driven by the food price inflation following the Ukraine war. The MPC raised the repo rate from 4% to 6.5% across 6 steps to 50 basis points of tightening in total. In 4th step, transition. The higher repo rate raised borrowing cost for banks, which with a typical lag of 3 to 6 months increased. Leading rates dampened credit growth, reduced aggregate demand, and eventually helped bringing inflation back within a target band. The fundamental lesson of this: data doesn't make a decision. People and institutions do. But the quality of data and the sophistication with which it's interpreted directly determine the quality of policy responses. So, this is the things, and with that I like to summarize the whole. We are covered a lot of ground today. Let me bring it together. Economy is about how people and society manage limited resources in the face of unlimited wants. Scarcity is a starting point. It is the first one. It is a fundamental condition from which all the economic analysis is flow. Secondly, opportunity cost we define. The value of what you give up when you make a choice. Sit at the heart of the sound economics, decision making. Every choice is a trade-off, and every resource has alternate uses. Thirdly, we discuss micro and macro economics. Micro examine individual behavior and specific market, from the price of onion to the structure of the telecom industry. Macroeconomics look at economy-wide pattern, GDP growth, inflation, fiscal policy. Fourthly, to track India's economy, we use a set of essential indicators: GDP for overall output, CPI and WPI for inflation, PLFS for unemployment, the IP for the industrial activity, and fiscal deficit figures for the government. Finance. Fifth one is the major data sources: the RBI, DBI's portal, Ministry, MOSPI, NSO publication, and SSO survey rounds, PLFS, CMI, consumer pyramids, and the union budget form the infrastructure of economics. Knowledge in India. You need to know where to find them and how to read them. Sixthly, careful data analysis require attention to data set structure, variable, definition, frequencies, and metadata. These aren't technicalities. They are the foundation of valid interpretations. Our students who worked through this chapter now carries 3 things forward: a way of thinking about economic problems, disciplines, evidence-based attentive to trade-off, a working knowledge of India's major indicators and where to find them, and practical skills to work with the real data critically and carefully. With that, I like to thank of you. Thank you very much.